Okay. To kick us off, again, thank you everyone for being here this Wednesday evening. I'll share my slide deck in a moment. My name is Jonathan Cohen. I'm the policy director here at Progressive Mass. We are delighted to be here to talk to you about the legislative process in Massachusetts. Whether you have dealt with it many a time or are dealing with it for the first time, it's always useful, in my opinion, to get a refresher because of the sometimes arcane, sometimes more complicated than they need to be dimensions of the legislative process in Massachusetts. And over the next 2 years of the legislative session and many years to come, there's a lot of important work that we need to do and that we can do on the state level. Okay, so I'm going to. Yeah, that's right. Okay, we'll try that again. Okay. Okay. Can everybody see my screen? Thumbs up?
Looking
Yes.
good.
Okay,
Yep.
awesome. So I will kick this off. As I go along, if you have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat as we go along. There will also be formal time for questions at the end. All questions are good. So again, just to kick this off, it's about kind of Beacon Hill 101, understanding the legislative process. I'll give a shout out to the stock photo of sunlight over the beacon of over the Golden Dome of the State House that I purchased for like $5 years ago and have gotten a lot of use out of. Uh, but just before diving in, okay. So tonight's event, we will be reviewing the legislative process here in Massachusetts. Along the way, we'll be highlighting different ways to make that legislative process better, both by highlighting some of the ways that it doesn't quite work. We will also explain how you can make a difference, which is the important part of this, about knowing the legislative process is the first step to knowing how to influence the legislative process. We will get ready for the next 2 years and beyond. I have an action for people to take, and we will obviously have opportunity for questions. So as a matter of introduction, if you're joining us for the first time, Progressive Massachusetts is a multi-issue, statewide, grassroots progressive advocacy organization. We focus on the state level here in Massachusetts. I often joke that state politics can be like the unloved middle child between local and national, but there's a lot of important work that happens at the state level across a number of issues that we care about. We're also a membership organization, means that members of the organization, which are anybody who donates to us across the year, help us with our setting our priorities and kind of organizational decision making. We do multi-issue work because we recognize that many of the issues are connected, and also the fact that the people who care about one issue tend to care about all of the other issues, which I'm guessing is true of many of you here tonight. That graphic at the bottom are the 4 different categories, the issues that we work on, shared prosperity, kind of racial and social justice, sustainable infrastructure and environmental protection, and good government and strong democracy. There's more information about all of that on our website. So why should you advocate for state policy? So on a basic level, policy is how we meet needs in ways that reflect our values. Let me pause for a second to make sure that I am in fact recording. Does it still say that it's recording? Because I had lost connection briefly and wanted to just realized I want to make sure I'm not losing this.
Yeah, it's recording.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. That if you need something or if you need something or value something, then policy is about you. And if policy is about you, then you should be caring about policy because it influences you whether or not you try to influence it. And many important issues are determined at the state level. Issues like the criminal legal system are primarily on the state level. Education policy is heavily state and also local. Housing policy has a lot on the state level. Environmental policy. So many other things that we care about, we can make important progress on the state level. And in some cases, the state level is the main area of focus. And we have the ability with state policy to make positive differences for countless people's lives. And then when we pass good policy, it spreads outward to other states and upward to the national level, hopefully. Okay. And why should your legislator hear from you? I always think of this study from about a decade ago that noted how many legislators, whether liberal or conservative, tend to believe that their constituents are more conservative than they really are. That conservative state legislators were wildly off in what they thought their districts thought, but even the liberal state legislators overstated the conservatism of their districts. And so it's the work for us to better align what legislators think of their districts with what their districts really are, but also to continue to do the work of educating kind of the public across districts on progressive issues to continue to move the ball forward. Okay, I think this is a duplication. Okay. One joke that I was thinking recently about how a bill does become a law or doesn't is that it is somewhat like a cross between Chutes and Ladders and Clue. Chutes and Ladders in the way in which you have all of the possible ways of rising or falling that you can't necessarily predict at the outset, as well as Clue in the way that what you're working on can be killed and you have no idea by whom. Just in the process. But despite that aspect of it, there are ways that you can still influence policy and make a difference, as many people who are on the Zoom I know have been able to do so over the years, and that we'll all be working together to do so in the coming years. So, of the Massachusetts state legislature, we here in Massachusetts have large Democratic supermajorities in both the House and the Senate. That in the Massachusetts Senate, there are 35 Democrats and five Republicans. I like to joke the Republicans in caucus can fit in a mid-sized sedan. In the Massachusetts Senate, in the Massachusetts House, it is kind of 133 Democrats, 25 Republicans, one unenrolled member who caucuses with Democrats, and one vacant seat that has a special election to be scheduled. Despite this large Democratic supermajority, we still often don't get everything done that we would like to see done for a number of reasons, including the over-centralization of power that exists in the State House. And as I often say there, that even with the best of intentions, if too few people are in charge of too many decisions, things slow down, and that you get kind of a large degree of inertia because of that. There are also interchamber power struggles that happen between the House and Senate that can slow down policymaking, as well as the fact that when things happen behind closed doors, the people who are best able to get behind those closed doors are people with lots of money and lots of power, so that we are still up against a number of powerful corporate interests or other entrenched interests in making sure that in kind of the work that we're doing of pushing forward, of kind of basically what we're up against. Okay, so in the State House, in the Senate president is Karen Spilka, a Democrat from Ashland. Her district includes communities like Ashland, Framingham, Medway, Hopkinton, Holliston. Then over on the House, the number one in rank is Speaker Ron Mariano, a Democrat from Quincy. His district includes Quincy, Weymouth, and Holbrook. Because of the structure of both the House and Senate, the number one in rank holds disproportionate influence on what happens and in setting the legislative agenda for what happens over that 2-year legislative session. That if anything is to pass, it typically needs to have their support behind it. Their support doesn't necessarily mean something will pass because they're also attuned to the opinions of their members, which is why bothering the rank and file legislators is also critically important. But it's also kind of an important thing to be aware of, that if you live in their districts, your voice matters, especially because the person that you would be advocating policies to has outsized power on how everything works. In terms of the other structure of leadership in the State House, in terms of people who are key decision makers, those include have the Speaker and Senate President pro tempore, pro tem, who are ones that preside over the body in the absence of the Speaker or Senate President. majority leaders and assistant majority leaders who help with the general running of affairs, whips and assistant whips who are in charge of making sure that votes end up how they want them to, division chairs, positions that exist in the House, that as a large body of 160, when the House is taking a vote, they have division chairs to manage each section of 40, as well as the Ways and Means chairs and vice chairs who manage the committee that puts together the budget and sees most legislation before it reaches the floor. Many of these people will be the same as they were last session. I didn't want to include their names because it's possible that there will be change, because those are positions that have not yet formally been appointed for the current session, I believe. So where are we now in the legislative timeline? The current legislative session began on Wednesday, January 1st. It always begins on the first Wednesday in January. And we are rapidly approaching the bill filing deadline, which will be this Friday, January 17th. It is the third Friday in January as a standard rule, leading to, note here, somewhere up like around 6,000 in some bills will end up being filed by this Friday. Some of them already have been. And this is the vast majority, like as in like well over 90% of all of the individual pieces of legislation that will be filed over the course of the 2-year legislative session. Some bills might be filed later, as noted here, called late files, but for the most part, your state representative and your state senator are spending this week filing pieces of legislation that they want to work on for the next 2 years. These can range from technical changes to sweeping bills. Many of them have been filed before, what is called refile of a piece of legislation. And then each one will get what's called a docket number, a specific reference number for that bill, which is formed with like an HD for House docket or an SD for Senate docket, as a way that if you're talking about that bill to a legislator, to reference that in particular and how they can look at it in an internal system. Okay, so then after bills get filed, by the end of this week, one of the main asks that you can make of your state legislators will be co-sponsorship. And co-sponsorship is when legislators add their name to a bill as a statement of support. It is a ground level ask. As I'll note later on, there are many additional asks that we can and should make of our legislators throughout the session, but co-sponsoring a bill is an easy initial ask that is them putting their name down on a bill saying, yes, I support this. It is legislators can co-sponsor a bill at any time until a bill leaves committee. You may be familiar with in the past, in the Massachusetts House of Representatives, there was a tight deadline for co-sponsoring bills. That does not exist anymore. And so they can at any point in the session, as long as that bill has not left committee, they can add their name to it and show their support. They can co-sponsor bills from either chamber. So if it's just a House only filed in the House or only filed in the Senate, they can still sign their name. And co-sponsorship is a way of building momentum behind a bill, engaging a support level. As that entry level ask, it helps you see how much support you have in the chamber, or in both chambers at any given time, as well as helps you figure out what is the best ask to make of any given legislator and how you can make sure that everybody is doing as much as they can. I will talk later about the excuses that legislators might be giving you later on in this presentation, so stay tuned for that. And just if you want kind of a visual representation of what co-sponsorship looks like, if you go to the legislator's website, you would see a list of names with the names and their districts kind of next to them. But an easier way for many bills would be to check out our own scorecard website of scorecard.progressivemass.com, where we will be updating co-sponsorship data for a number of critical bills in our soon-to-be formed legislative agenda for the session. And you can see that for the past legislative session of whether your legislators were signing on to a number of the bills that we were prioritizing. Okay, so coming soon in the legislative process will be the rules for the House and Chamber and to the bodies taken together, what are called the joint rules. In the rules, the legislature, both the House and the Senate, they set timelines, deadlines, committee processes, and they determine the access to different pieces of information. We will talk a little bit more about all of that later. But the one thing I wanted to note here is that we have one of the least transparent legislatures in the country, and that the legislative rules and the access to information that they don't provide are a major culprit in that fact. As you can see here, Massachusetts does compare unfavorably to most other states in the country in terms of public records law, where in most states, the public records law does apply to the legislative branch, but in Massachusetts, along with Minnesota, Iowa, and Oklahoma, it unfortunately does not. So far too much ends up happening behind closed doors. So after, and I'll touch a little bit more later about rules. After the rules get voted on, then there will be committee assignments. So committees are the bodies that hold hearings, they draft legislation, and they vote to advance or defeat legislation. There are 33 joint committees across subject areas like public health, like healthcare financing, education, consumer protection, and many other areas each have a designated committee. There are 9 additional committees that are unique to the House, 9 committees unique to the Senate, and then there are, which puts, taken together, 42 committee chairs and 42 committee vice chairs for each chamber. So some questions about these. So if you're wondering with kind of the committee process, who decides who chairs a committee, the Senate, the Speaker and the Senate President, and anybody that they choose to involve in that process decides who serves on every committee. You may be familiar that in Congress, you might have seen in the House, there were recent battles about who should be the top ranking person on several committees, like AOC fighting to be the head of the Oversight Committee, or Jamie Raskin fighting and then successfully becoming the chair of the Judiciary Committee, or Angie Craig becoming the chair of Agriculture against like a next in line or sitting person. That is not how it works in Massachusetts. It is one person and whomever they choose to involve, choosing every position of every chair, vice chair, and composition of these committees. If your legislator was on a certain committee last session, it is not a guarantee that they will stay. And if they were chair, it is not a guarantee that they stay. They play a game of musical chairs, basically every legislative session, which can make it somewhat difficult in terms of them actually building deeper knowledge on certain bills. And if you're wondering if a committee assignment reflects experience or passion in a specific issue, that's another it depends. Sometimes legislators all have the ability to ask which committees that they serve on, but it does not mean that they have any expertise on what that committee does, or that's even like a top priority issue for them, which can lead to somewhat of a mismatch. I want to highlight some recent Globe coverage about committees in the legislature that were in the Globes. Has had a series looking at the legislature where they talked about how with the pay bump received for chairing committees, that there are still some committees that don't even hear bills, despite the chair is getting a lot of additional money. Recommend reading that whole series from the Globe in full, because there are a number of interesting pieces there that give some much needed perspective on what happens in the legislature. The legislature has a fairly hierarchical pay structure, which is something that can fuel some of the problems in the way that the legislature works. As you can see here, with the Speaker and the Senate President getting over $100,000 in additional compensation beyond the base pay, and all of the different leadership positions and chairmanships and vice chairmanships coming with additional pay. That leads to what I often call a two bosses problem in the Massachusetts State House, where the typical way that we understand things is that the person who can hire and fire you and the person who controls your pay is the same person, and that is somebody that you would call your boss. However, in the legislature, Your constituents are the ones who can decide whether to hire or fire you. That's called elections. However, the House and Senate leadership are the ones who determine your pay. And because of that, if that and the lack of contested elections for the most part in Massachusetts, that leads to a large degree of insularity, where boss number two can be can have a lot of extra weight, and it is our job as advocates and activists to assert the importance of that boss number one, the constituents who decide whether or not any state legislator keeps their job. Okay. You can go on. I know there are questions in the chat. I will answer them at the end. I think that's the easiest way for me to handle that, and I apologize. So starting around March, there will be hearings. Every single bill that gets filed will get sent to a committee, will be assigned a number, and will be scheduled for a hearing. Hearings can be announced with as little as 72 hours notice, something that is desperately in need of change, because people should have the ability to align their schedule accordingly. That committee members listen to testimony and can ask questions. If they attend, I would say more legislators should actually attend these hearings to listen to the many often very important and compelling testimony that will exist. These hearings can sometimes also have somewhat of a Groundhog Day feeling to them, where many of the same people and the same organizations will show up to testify on the same bill, as had done so 2 years prior. Sometimes the members up on the bench are the same, sometimes that they are different. But that speaks to some of that, it's that like cyclical inertia of the legislative process, that legislators can often act like they're hearing about something for the first time in a new hearing. However, if you are interested in watching a hearing on a bill that you care about, the hearings are all available online on the legislature's website. In terms of testifying at hearings, anybody can do that, and that includes you. And if you, when you're testifying at hearings, you're not only speaking to the legislators there, you are also speaking to anybody else in the room whom you might be able to connect with to help continue to mobilize and organize about the issue that you care about. You are also speaking to press, because you want to make sure that if it's an issue that you care about, the coverage of a hearing reflects the perspective that you want to see advanced. And that hearing can show how the immense support behind an issue. It could show the immense opposition behind a hearing, and you have the power to shape what that is. Coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic, the legislature adopted rules to allow hybrid testimony for hearings, so you don't need to come directly into the State House to testify, which can make it much easier, so that if it's in the middle of the workday for you, that you would have the ability to kind of linger and do other things, and then only hop on when it's your time to testify, with testimony typically being 3 minutes. And in terms of that, it's useful to show up if you have a compelling story to share about a specific piece of legislation and the impact that it can have on you and people that you care about and issues that you care about. It's worth testifying, whether that means showing up in person to do so, or simply submitting written testimony, or just showing up to a hearing to show support. If you have the time in your day to do so, every extra person can help with creating momentum behind a bill. Unfortunately, as I noted in my last point there, after that hearing, although that video exists, the legislature, unlike some of our neighboring states, does not actually have a list of who testified on a bill, which can be useful for better understanding what's at stake in a bill. That if you see a piece of legislation with labor aligned on one side and a bunch of big corporations on the other, you know what was going on. And that's one change that kind of reform advocates have been rightfully pushing in recent years. Okay, so after committees have held all of their different hearings, they have to take an action on every single bill. The legislature has a deadline, what's called Joint Rule 10 Day. It's a deadline that's the first Wednesday in February of an even-numbered year. So that's going to be February 4th of next year, unless otherwise changed. They can choose to do one of several things with a bill. They can give a bill a favorable report, which means that they send it out of committee. That's sometimes said as advancing, voting something out, reporting out. They can give a bill what's called an adverse report, which is voting it down. That bill is then dead. They can send a bill to study, which means tabling that bill. There's no study being done of that bill. It's a way of dispensing with it for the rest of the legislative session. They can discharge a bill to another committee, saying that they think that another committee is better able to handle a bill than they are. They can grant an extension, which they often do, basically creating another deadline later on. And they can combine and redraft bills, where they attach related bills to each other, but without necessarily providing the explanation for doing so. If you're following a specific bill, always make sure to read the text if they're redrafting bills to know how it has actually changed. Okay, so about that committee process, right? So there's a hearing, they eventually have to take an action. Something is happening in between. And a lot of what happens in between from our side is going to be the work of advocacy. If you're wondering if you can contact members of a committee, even if you don't live in their district, the answer, of course, is yes. If committee members are legislating for the entire state, they should have to listen to people wherever they are in the state. However, know that as a constituent of a specific legislator, your voice is always the most powerful. So always know that if your legislator serves in some particular role, that you will be able to have extra power in influencing what they do in that role compared to other legislators. And how much power do individual committee members have? With that, it can often depend. In most committees, they can be fairly top down, with the chairs of in the House and Senate having the vast majority of the power in determining a bill outcome. When that committee ultimately makes its decision, unlike the majority of states, we do not see their votes. We should see their votes in committee, but they do not publish the recorded votes of what they do, as the Senate does so on Senate-only committees, but they do not do that for their joint committees of House and Senate together, or House-only committees. If on the municipal level, I can say that this is the true for the Boston City Council. There are often public working sessions on an ordinance on the council level, where the kind of councilors meet and talk about their positions on an issue and workshop something to get an ultimate proposal. That unfortunately does not exist on the state level either. Your local elected officials are subject to open meeting law, so they have to do much of their work in public. On the state level, they are not subject to open meeting law. They are not subject to public records law. So much of the public's work is not done in public on the state level. So if a bill gets out of committee, it then goes to either the Ways and Means Committee, which is for anything that touches money, which is most things, or the Policy and Steering Committee. It can be changed again there before it ends up getting to the floor. On the floor of the chamber for a final vote. So if you're following a piece of legislation, be mindful of the fact that changes can occur at any given step of the way. But in simply getting out of one committee is not a guarantee of anything ultimately being voted on, which is why that pressure that we build throughout the session is so critical, to make sure that there's a kind of a steady drumbeat bringing things all the way up to the finish line. To mix metaphors, I just did there. When a bill is scheduled for a vote on the floor, legislators will have the opportunity to file amendments. During that debate, kind of on the House or Senate floor, amendments can be adopted, means that they're included in a redrafted bill. They can be rejected, excluded from that redrafted bill. Amendments can be redrafted and adopted in different form. They can be what's called bundled or consolidated. In the Senate, that means typically they do actually physically bundle amendments together. On the House side, they typically don't actually keep the individual text when they combine things. And many legislators simply withdraw the amendments that they file. If a legislator expects that their amendment is not going to be included, many of them simply withdraw it without discussion, without debate, rather than see it voted down. And in recent years in the legislative process, we've seen less in the way of debate and less in the way of actual votes on things, which harms the work of actually keeping legislators accountable. When a legislature gets to the point of passing a bill, they can decide the vote by either what's called a voice vote or a roll call vote. A voice vote goes along the lines of all those in favor say aye, all those opposed say no. The ayes have it. The motion is adopted, typically at even faster speed than what I did there. Or they can take what's called a roll call vote, which is a call of the yeas, a call of the nays, and everybody's name accordingly with the vote that they cast. They have clickers in the House and Senate, or particularly in the House, to do this. The Senate can also do what are called standing votes, which I think are particularly cowardly. Standing vote is when you ask those in favor to stand, and then you ask those opposed to stand. So everybody present knows how everybody else voted, but nobody at home knows how anybody voted. And it is something that they occasionally do if they would like to see where colleagues stand on something, but lack the courage to actually put them on record. If for something to even get a vote in the House or Senate, you need 16 state reps, 10% of the chamber to stand to request a vote. Or in the Senate, you need 8 state senators, 20% of the chamber to stand to request a vote. And then it would happen. The reason why recorded votes happen is if you're a legislator and you want to show your position on an issue that's important to you, if you want to get your colleagues to go on record on an issue, or sometimes the law simply requires it for things like overriding a governor's veto or passing bonding legislation, which are that kind of authorization of the state's borrowing power. From a perspective of advocacy, recorded votes are important because they show us where legislators stand on things. And that if we want to hold people accountable to the values that they express during the campaign or throughout the session, recorded votes are the best ways available to us at following up and identifying the follow-through from legislators. Also why they are taking fewer of them over time. If you're looking to find out how your legislator voted on something, there is a voice vote or a standing vote. You simply can't. Unfortunately, if there's a roll call vote, you can find those votes on the bill's page on the legislature's website or on the House or Senate Journal. One of the easiest ways, though, would be follow Progressive Mass on social media. Check out our blog at progressivemass.com. Read our newsletter, where we can often include those in emails, or check our scorecard website, where we update that periodically with key votes from the legislative session. The legislature has been taking fewer and fewer votes over time, which is a disappointing outcome that, again, minimizes the ability to hold legislators accountable for things. You can see that they're taking well under half the number of votes as they used to over a decade ago. Okay, so if both chambers pass a bill, what happens next? So that what ends up resulting after that is what's called a conference committee, where two Democrats and one Republican from either chamber come together and are tasked with negotiating a compromise. They must eventually then produce a piece of legislation that the House and then Senate will have to vote on for it to then be sent to the governor thereafter. It is, as you should always be seeking to influence your legislators in the process at every step, you can lobby those 6 members of the conference committee. Again, if you live in those members' districts, you have outsized voice in that process because they have to listen to you. You vote for them. They're supposed to serve you. But because, again, if people are legislating for the whole state, and especially in the form of negotiating a final compromise for the full state, they should still have to hear from you. But you should also be asking your legislator to do so as well, to lobby to their colleagues about the outcomes that you hope to see. Unfortunately, these conference committees themselves operate like a black box. It is never clear when they're meeting, to produce legislation. Which is why keeping external pressure is important to make sure that they actually come up with a compromise that meets our needs. After a bill gets passed by both chambers, it goes to the governor. The governor can either sign a bill, veto a bill in full or in part, which the legislature can override with a 2/3 vote. The governor can choose to do nothing. And if the governor does nothing and the legislature is in a formal session, then the bill, after 10 days, becomes law on its own. Or the governor can choose to send back amendments to demand that the legislature change certain things. There's also an important part of the legislative process is the budget, which ends up taking up a good amount of time in the first half of every year. In late January, so later this month, the governor will file a budget. There will be hearings on that budget in March. The House will vote on a budget in April, the Senate in May, and then by June 30th, the legislature is supposed to be passing a budget. We have been the last state in the country to do so in recent years. However, that deadline still exists for a reason, and they should follow it. If there ends up being a funding mismatch and the need for additional funds for different departments, the legislature takes up what's called a supplemental budget at other points in the legislative process. In terms of earmarks, term people may be familiar with, I will shout out the Globe's coverage of this recently as well, kind of earlier last year, about how the House and Senate work around earmarks. In the Senate, every member gets the same amount of money, noted here, but with the Senate president and the chair of the Ways and Means getting outsized money. In the House, the top ranking members of leadership will get outsized money, and then everything else goes somewhat akin to the rank of how much they like individual members, which again is just another force increasing the deference of rank and file legislators to the whims of leadership. Okay, so I talked a lot about what might be happening in this session on a kind of macro level. The current legislative session that we're in runs through January 5th, 2027. However, the end of the what's called the formal legislative session will be July 31st of next year. After July 31st, they're not likely to come into person, coming in person into the State House to do work. After that, things can only pass by what is called unanimous consent. That means that there is nobody present to object, so that they typically, or at least in theory, are supposed to only be taking up non-controversial legislation afterwards that would have nobody there to object to it. We saw the problems with them pushing off many things to informal session this past legislative session, as an example being the one home rule petition from the city of Boston about shifting some of the tax burden. That one senator was able to show up, Senator Nick Collins, and block it from even consideration, because as long as one person is there after July 31st, they can block a bill from being considered at all. Okay, so I only will have a little bit more for this presentation before then entertaining your questions, but wanted to talk a little bit more about lobbying, right? That work of how do we influence this process itself. Lobbying is about both persuasion and pressure. About persuasion of trying to change people's minds, and pressure showing intensity, showing breadth and depth of support and influencing them that way as well. By lobbying, as grassroots lobbying, we're trying to turn our supporters into champions, turning fence sitters into supporters, and trying to turn our opposition into bystanders. Because if you want to see a bill become a law, each one of these steps is important in bringing people along that spectrum. I also always like to remind people that many legislators don't hear from their constituents that often, outside of, let's say, constituent services requests. So that knowing that if you can organize several of your friends and neighbors to contact your state legislators about issues of importance to you, that can help make a difference in raising the profile of something for them and possibly securing their support. Why should you do this work of lobbying? So yeah, let's say yes, even if you should do this, even if your legislators are already reliably progressive. You might think, my legislator does everything I ask them to do. Why should I even email them or call them about things? The value for doing that in those cases is that you're creating both, let's say, positive reinforcement and backup for somebody if they are doing the right thing. One, people like being told that they are doing the right thing. It helps keep people who are doing the right thing in the work of doing the right thing. It also helps them take steps further, especially if they're talking to colleagues or talking to the key decision makers, if they can say how they're being bombarded with calls from their constituents and how it's something that's really necessary for their own self-preservation to do something. So that is helpful because you're backing them up if they're already where you want them to be and asking them to take steps further. If you say your legislator says no to everything that you ever ask. They're solidly conservative. Why should I even bother with it? In that case, I would say you should still contact your state legislators because you want them to know that you have people watching everything that they do. Maybe they'll decide that they don't like the job anymore because they realize how out of step with the district they are. They won't learn that if you aren't bothering them throughout the year. It's also important if if your state rep or your state senator is a member of leadership, they sometimes say that they won't sign on to different bills and they won't really give you a clear understanding of where they stand. It is still useful to raise things in their profile. As I noted, if there are like 6,000 plus bills, any step that you can do to raise the profile of something helps increase increase the likelihood that it could ultimately pass. To put point that I was noting before, your legislator does something good, they should hear from you. They do something bad, they should hear from you. In general, it's important that the people who represent you hear from you because that is an essential incentive structure. I always like to remind people as well that the critical powers that we have over legislators are the ability to hire and fire them, elections, and the ability to give or deny them bad press. That latter point is critical to what I noted before in terms of reinforcing good behavior, criticizing bad behavior, and that's something that you have the ability to do. I always note that if I were a state legislator, I would probably have a Google alert on my name, and I expect many of them do as well. As I've noted before, there are a number of things you can ask legislators to do, and you should continue to ask them to take. Oh, that's actually my next slide. There are an escalating ladder of things that you can do. And so, as I noted before, most legislators aren't used to hearing from constituents that often. And so if you have, let's say, 5, 10 people calling them about one bill on one day, that can feel like a lot. If that many people called me about something on one day, I would wonder what's going on. So, and they do as well. However, each different step that you can take can have additional impact. You will get many action alerts from us. What I would recommend when we send you something with a form letter, any work that you can do to personalize that has value because personalized letters are viewed as carrying more weight than a simple form letter by legislators. A phone call will often be weighted more heavily. It helps kind of raise the profile of something. Showing up in person is even better. Showing up and bringing friends, neighbors, etc., even more impactful. Doing it over again, and then bringing in more and more people. Every one of us knows people in our community that we can ask to also contact our state legislators about an issue that we care about, since we're all kind of relational creatures who know people around us, and you should be always thinking of how to continue to build that capacity to influence your elected officials. I also remind people to my point about media, you take action and no one hears about it. Does it make a sound? And that's the value of talking about this, whether that's in terms of social media, talking about issues so that you can also ask other people to take action or raise the profile of an issue for them. Writing letters to the editor or editorials in a local paper, if you're so lucky to still have local media, or earned media, which can happen with rallies and press conferences, are all ways of shaping the process. We also have an escalating ladder of asks that you can ask of your legislators themselves. As I noted before, co-sponsoring a bill is that ground level ask for legislators where you can ask them to do more after that. And that can include things like advocating to leadership or to their colleagues. It can be organizing other colleagues with, let's say, internal sign-on letters. It can mean doing things publicly so that they speak out about the need to pass legislation publicly or write pieces about that or do other steps to raise the profile of something. And if they're ever telling you that they're doing an additional step, it's always good to ask for receipts to follow through. So one of my last things in this is just going a few commonly heard excuses that you might get from your legislators. Sometimes if you're asking them to support something, you'll hear them say that they're just not familiar with this issue and that's not why they're doing something. If you're providing them with the information about an issue, they no longer have the right to say that they're not familiar with the issue. Sometimes that you'll hear an excuse of like of a lack of expertise or focus, where somebody will tell you that their expertise is on whatever issue and they only focus on that, and that they can't read or co-sponsor all of the bills. At the end of the day, they're responsible for voting on all of those topics, even if they are not experts on all of those topics, and so that they should still be paying attention to them earlier. You might hear legislators say that there's just no pressure on them for something, that their constituents aren't calling them about it, their constituents don't care about that, and that's why it's a responsibility for us to show that their constituents do in fact care about it. If you're asking them to do it, you're showing them why that excuse doesn't work. Sometimes you'll hear legislators say that their district is too conservative to do something. That is the value of the progressive organizing that we're doing to help increase the breadth and intensity of progressive voices in the district. And frankly, nowhere in Massachusetts is as conservative as as in many other states. As I can say from growing up in a fairly conservative suburb of Philadelphia, that is would be one of the most conservative towns by Massachusetts standards, but it's fairly like middle of the road in PA. Sometimes you hear a lack of will of just how legislators say that they don't sign on to things, or if they're a chair, that they don't take position on something because it harms their ability to negotiate. As I noted before, they have to vote on all of this legislation if it gets to the floor. That's not like the fact there aren't good excuses to not sign on to something because of that. And if they file their own bills, they can sign on to other bills, even if it's in the committee. Sometimes legislators will say, don't bother me, spend your time on everybody else. And at the end of the day, as I noted before, we need every single person to be taking additional steps. And you can thank, if they are doing what they need to do, you can thank them and ask them how to help build pressure on their colleagues as well. You'll hear from some legislators, particularly for the reasons I noted before about the deferential nature that can be given to those in higher rank. Of what does the leadership think about it? Like, does the speaker support this? Does the Senate president support this? The end of the day, you voted them into power. Their constituents voted them into power. They were not voted into their office by Senate President Spilka or Speaker Ron Mariano. So they should be listening to their constituents. You may hear legislators tell you that they just don't have the time for something. They're very busy with the budget. Again, they're a full-time legislature. If they're a full-time legislature, they have the time and they should be putting it in. You may hear from your legislators that we don't have the money to do X, Y, or Z. Massachusetts has a similar GDP to the country of Sweden. We have the money to do what we need to do if we're willing to raise it. And that speaks to a lack of will to raise it. What was more common under Republican Governor Charlie Baker than kind of Governor Maura Healey now is legislators telling you that the governor doesn't support something, so why should they do it? Again, to my prior point, the governor does not elect them or appoint them. You do, and you're the ones that they should be listening to. So a few key takeaways about lobbying. I always like to tell people that 90% of politics is just showing up. A good chunk of the remaining 10% is showing up every other time. Always ask for receipts. If somebody tells you that they're doing something, make sure that they do. And it's not necessarily even out of malice that they might not. Malice or ignorance, that if there's a lot going on, things fall through the cracks. So it's always good to follow up. Critically, you probably know more than your legislators about a lot already. Many legislators are not experts on anything. However, you as their constituent, if you care about an issue, if that issue directly impacts you, you know about that and your voice needs to be heard and they should be hearing it. And if a vote occurs and no one talks about it, did it even happen? Again, to my point about helping to build that public pressure throughout a legislative session. So I will show believe two more slides, and then I will take questions from folks. I just wanted to make a short pitch. We will be having our annual meeting on February 1st. It is in person at LaSalle University in Newton. It is near the Pike. It is near the Green Line. It is near the commuter rail. You can arrive there in the afternoon in many different ways, and we would love to see you there. And then a pitch for engagement. Become a member. Grassroots organizing requires grassroots fundraising, so we depend on people like you to do our work. If you're in an area that already has a chapter, I encourage you to get involved with the chapter so that you can help organize to put pressure on your state legislators locally. If you're in an area without a chapter and you're interested in starting a chapter, let us know. If you're in a group that already exists that would like to be affiliating with us, we love that too. Stay tuned for action alerts, lobby days, and so much more throughout the session. I will skip an action slide and go to questions. And I apologize for not taking the questions that existed throughout this presentation. So let me stop my screen share. Okay, let me put myself on spotlight, and I am happy to take any people's questions. I don't know if Melanie or Dan, if you've managed any queue of questions. I see some questions with about whether the slides will be available, and I'm happy to share the slides available. I saw a question about the annual meeting. The annual meeting will be in person. We are hoping to live stream part of it, but the bulk of that will be in person. But if you have questions, the floor is open for questions. You can drop them in the chat or use the function.
I got a few of them down as we were going.
I raised my hand too.
Okay, I'll take Paul's with a hand raised, and then Dan, if you want to feed them from the chat.
So I had 3 that I put in the chat. Let me do all 3 and then you can answer all 3.
Awesome.
During the first year, do they vote? Number 2, do they stay in session the whole first year? Number 3, let's say that you have 100 sponsors of a bill in the House and it's past the joint rule date in February of the second year. Is there a way to force a vote?
Great questions. Okay, so during the first year, do they vote on things? Yes. They don't, not as much as they should, but they will still vote on things. They will definitely pass the budget. They have passed some legislation during that first year. Thinking of the past legislative session, the House and Senate both voted on pay equity legislation in that first odd numbered year. The House took up a kind of a gun violence prevention bill then. And I believe there were other bills passed by the Senate during that year. And the legislature, as the procrastinators that they are, will typically run out the clock till the very end with the July 31st deadline and push everything to the end because nothing inspires action like a deadline, but they still can and should be asked to do more in that first year and that is something that is very much a cultural problem where they push a lot till the very end. During the first year, they're largely in formal session that the entirety of the first year. They will typically go out for the end of December. I believe it's typically like December 15th to the end of the year where they're in informal session. There are some kind of for a period of time. There are just general days that they're in informal session, right? If nobody's coming in, that is still an informal session. But for an extended period of informal session is only after that July 31st, with that period prior to that being some days are formal sessions carried in, but there's no, it's not like weeks upon weeks of informal sessions as exist after that. If you have a number of co-sponsors on a bill past that day, so after that deadline for bills, typically, if a bill doesn't get out of committee then, one of the most common things that happens is it just gets another deadline because legislators don't like treating their rules as that serious. So they just extend it to another day and another day. Also, to your point, the legislature does have a process for discharge petitions. It never gets used. I have never seen it get used. Maybe someday it will, but you do have a process as akin to Congress where a majority of legislators can attempt to force a vote on things. So that does exist. I think they should use it more because there are a number of cases, as you noted, where you can see a strong majority of legislators behind something and still no action.
Thank you.
No problem. Great questions. Let me go through those with the hand raise function, and I'll go for Dan for kind of some chat bundling. Forgive me, is it Dacia or Dacia?
Gracias.
Dacia. Okay.
Hi. I just wanted to, because it was lagging a little bit, I just wanted to know what day was the meeting at LaSalle University?
Yeah,
What,
that's going to be February 1st, and I can drop it into the chat as well. Let me do that right now.
so if I go to that meeting, I'll be able like to connect more with you guys and know more about
Exactly. So
everything that's going on.
exactly. And we'll have a number at that meeting. We'll have a number of different breakout sessions around some different issues and different skill sets, as well as just opportunities to network with activists across the state.
Okay. Is
And
this the evening?
it'll be in the afternoon from 1 to 5.
Oh, okay. How about like, I probably can't make it then because I have to go to work. I need to go to work at that time.
But if you're able to make for anything, we'll keep, if you can't make to that event, we will have other events throughout the year and we hope you can join us. And if you have questions, just never, don't hesitate to reach out.
Okay. Thank you so much.
No problem.
Okay.
Said Nancy had to leave before her question was answered. Matt.
Good evening, Jonathan. Thank you for providing this service to us as always. Can you hear me?
Yes, go.
Okay. I've got 2 or 3 questions. One, I feel that we spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to get these bills passed, when at the end of the day, what seems to me is the traditional reliable strategy is organizations, they come up with the bills, they have hearings, but everybody knows that over 99% of these bills are going to die in committee. So they're just redrafted and introduced as amendments to either the budget or some major bonding bill. Okay, so I've got a group and we've got a bill we're going to file on Friday, and I've been telling everybody it's going to die. But we're going to get a hearing, and then next year we could probably try to get through it. But that's just, it seems like that's kind of how it works, but we don't generally talk about that for people to be successful. But anyway, so I guess my question is, sometimes when I watch the House and the Senate stuff, a lot of times Paul Donato, or in the Senate, I forget the guy, the presiding officer generally said, it looks like there's no vote whatsoever.
Mhm.
And it's already decided by leadership, and they just say blah, blah, blah. Nobody says anything, and it's passed.
Mhm.
There is no vote. And it seems that leadership basically tells all the people, I'm going to reject this. So don't make a fool out of yourself by asking for a roll call vote. And the only people that have the courage to do that, though, are the Republicans, because they know they're going to fail anyway.
Mhm.
So they like to publicly die on their swords. So are they actually voting, or just leadership just says, I will let this pass, or no?
Okay, those are both excellent questions. I'll do the first and then the second. So there's been an unfortunate tendency in recent years to just do like massive omnibus bills. And it's actually kind of akin to what's happened in recent years in Congress as well, where in Congress, they typically just do giant omnibus bills for their like continuing resolutions or their budgets and pack everything into one giant bill because they can't do things through regular process. And that's similar to what happens here. So where the budget becomes a vehicle for passing legislation, or they just combine all things about a topic into a giant bond authorization bill and take up fairly few standalone pieces of legislation. And as I had on a slide for an update last year, that they are passing fewer standalone bills than they used to. It's good. The value of keeping pressure on something throughout the kind of process is just so that if the time arises that you can get it attached to something, maybe they'll take it up on their own. Often that can be waiting for some either point of external pressure makes them take action on something, or somehow the political winds change, so that keeping things live and active so they can be lifted by something is particularly important, as well as that they can be shamed into inaction. And I feel like that'll be especially important over the next 4 years when we'll be seeing a number of terrible things coming out of DC. And we need our legislature here to step up their game and not accept excuses for their like comparative inaction on a number of issues. On the lack of votes on things, that also speaks to an unfortunate problem over the years of that where they are simply taking fewer votes than they used to. A number of previous state reps have talked about this phenomenon, particularly in the House, where I know that several years ago that why am I blanking at it? Representative Corey Atkins, from the representative from Concord, talked about how the voting board used to look like a Christmas tree with a mix of red and green for yes and no votes, and largely now it's something decided when it shows up. One of the things that's important, that's been unfortunate, and I'd say very different, like unfortunate for us if we're trying to put together a scorecard, for instance, that they have fewer and fewer actual meaningful recorded votes, where when something arises to the floor, it often just has like it's either party line or sometimes unanimous because of so much of that decision-making process happens behind closed doors. As noted, the open meeting law doesn't apply to them, and they make a number of those decisions behind closed doors without our ability to see that. And I'll have some asks about that a little bit later if we have the time.
Thank you.
I see. Let me go. Dan, let me go to Dan if you have any questions bundled from the chat, and then I'll tag in Margaret.
Yeah, I got a quick one that was, looked like a few people were asking it. What did you mean by always get receipts when you meet with
Yes.
legislators?
Okay. That is an excellent follow-up question. So what I mean with that is that if both receipts are, for instance, if your legislator is telling you that they're voting a certain way, actually make sure that they do. I've heard of legislators lying to their constituents about how they are going to be voting the next day on something. I can say that I know one state senator who told advocates he was going to vote yes on a bill, and then he voted no the next day. Say also if that your legislator tells you that they are sending a letter to the speaker or the Senate president on something, ask to see the letter so that you know that it exists. That if there's anything that they are doing, that they are telling you that they are doing that could be verifiable, ask to see that they're doing it as a basic way of making sure that it happens. Any other thing, Dan, anything else from the chat that came up a lot?
I didn't really notice a lot of other ones being repeat questions, except for, can I get the slides or when will the recording be available?
Yes.
But,
and then, Dan, go.
The one question that I thought was interesting was, has Progressive Mass considered sponsoring a potential constitutional amendment superseding the open meeting law public records exemptions for the legislature? Would Progressive Mass endorse a campaign for such an amendment if someone else initiated it? I don't believe we've ever been directly involved in sponsoring a ballot question, whether it's a regular ballot question or a constitutional amendment. But I mean, that definitely sounds interesting, right?
Yeah, no, I feel like that, and it doesn't necessarily, I feel like it doesn't inherently need to be constitutional. If you're trying to pass a constitutional amendment, it takes a longer process than any particular ballot question. I'll give a shout out. There'll be a ballot question session at our annual meeting on February 1st. If you're doing a constitutional amendment, it does take a multi-year process with votes of the legislature.
With the constitutional amendment, there's two paths to it, and one of them is the legislature initiates it and it has to get actually like a majority support, I think, from the legislature.
Exactly. It either
two different sessions.
Exactly. So it can happen one of two ways. Either it has to be a citizen petition, and if you collect signatures across the state, then the legislature has to take 2 votes and needs 25% of the chamber. If they initiate it, they need 50% of the chamber.
Right. So even if you do the ballot question for the 25%, you actually need 25% to vote for it. And if the speaker is controlling, their pay through chair positions, their funding, their earmarks, that's a big risk to vote against what the speaker wants, even if you only need 25%.
Yes, so that makes it harder. Like a regular ballot question, which doesn't have the same security as constitutional change, is definitely more viable. I've heard of people be interested in that, particularly not on open meeting law, but on the public records law, to get the public records law to actually apply to the legislature. That oh, that's interesting. I see Andrew's question about how because the legislature makes its own rules, things would have to be constitutional rather than a ballot. The question about the schedule for the February 1st, that's going to be available later this week. I think I finally have everybody booked that'll be speaking with it, speaking for it. But let me go to the raised hands, to go to Margaret, then Susan, then Dean, and I'll also be scrolling through the chat for questions.
Hi, yeah, this is Margaret Heights from Lexington, and I've been speaking for the last year since Michelle Sokola was elected.
Mhm.
She told us, she sprung on us last April that she is rethinking about whether she wants to co-sponsor bills at all during this session. And I'm wondering, it kind of floored me. Like, how do you get to, what's the point of trying to influence somebody who isn't going to, sign on? And she's not the only one. There's another rep in Lexington who I guess already has a policy of. So when we go on lobbying trips, to see everybody, this fella, Ken Gordon, just, it's like, let's not even bother going to see him.
Yeah.
So what's the recommendation of?
I would say with that is that it's even if they won't commit to actually signing on. So if they won't sign on to a piece of legislation, you lose that like receipts, right? If I was saying always asking for receipts, them signing their name and when they say that they'll support something is an example of a receipt. It's still valuable to push her on things because if there are things that she can do, because she needs to hear from what her constituents care about, and that if a bill were to come up and they start asking members where they stand on it, she needs to be knowing that that her constituents really want her to be supporting something. If ever a piece of legislation is controversial, they'll often poll members, or they'll often try to get a read of how many votes that there are in support of something. If they really want it to be there, the votes become there. But if they're not fully committed to it, they'll get a sense of where the chamber is. So keeping pressure on her, knowing that you might not get a receipt out of her from anything, it's still useful. It still raises a profile of something. It's also worthwhile anytime you have to highlight that it's not a good excuse when she tries to tell you that she's not signing on to things. Is also worth highlighting it so that maybe a little bit of like her putting on kind of on the hot seat in front
Can
of
you say anything about her motive for not co-sponsoring? I mean, it seems to be pretty common practice to co-sponsor, and now,
It's basically so that she can't be held like if legislators aren't doing it, it's because they don't want to be held accountable to anything.
that's it.
So like it's not there's no good argument behind that. It's people who don't want to feel boxed in by any prior commitments, and there's no good reason for not making commitments on things.
Yeah.
So
Thanks.
yeah, keep on her. I think I think I had Susan next and then Dean.
Oops, sorry, thanks. So this is a bit of a follow-up on the question about inertia being the dominant energy in the
Yeah.
Mass State House. So, I mean, I really agree that getting things done through the budget is often the most effective way because the budget is a bill that passes every year. It has to be enacted every year. And so unlike other bills. But what I've really noticed in the time I've been doing lobbying is that, even when you have a sponsor who really agrees with you, there's a difference between getting a sponsor, getting co-sponsors, and getting someone who's really going to go to the mat for your bill, because that's what it takes in order to even have a chance of moving a bill. And, at least that's been my experience. And, especially if leadership isn't particularly interested, but maybe could be moved, it really means that they have to make this like they're one or two top priorities of all the bills that they're sponsoring. And I'm just curious what strategies, I mean, if you agree with that, I'm curious what strategies you've used to build that kind of, light that kind of fire under
Yeah.
the legislators you worked with.
I'm actually, if somebody doesn't mind my calling on them, if you're here, is she still here? No, she's not. I was going to put Dalida on the hot seat because I thought Dalida Arsha, who was here earlier, who is currently the executive director of Neighbor to Neighbor and used to work at SEIU 32BJ, I thought did an excellent job of that with the Work and Family Mobility Act a few sessions ago, where that campaign had put together a broad coalition of organizations and had worked on both getting people across many different districts to make sure that they are constantly building up the numbers of support behind something and knowing exactly how many legislators they had in support of that at any given time, as well as a number of briefings of figuring out who are the different community validators that legislators need to hear from and how did they making sure that they heard from those specific people so that there was that type of like multiple levels of which people were hearing from their constituents or like not just constituents but other folks, so that there was constituent pressure in a district, that there was like internal organizing amongst legislators, as well as the work of constantly hearing different messengers to legislators about the importance of a topic, as well as then feeding into media coverage, making something seem like it is an issue that the legislature will take up. And it does, I think you noted the point, because of how, because the legislature operates from a position of scarcity rather than a position of abundance in terms of policy making, legislators do end up having to put basically outsized focus on a few things to make sure that any of them get across the finish line.
Thank you.
No, thank you. It's an excellent question. Dean.
Thanks, Jonathan. So it looks like in terms of legislative rules and practices, we're in stasis right now. And the one thing that seems like it might potentially shake things up is the audit by the state auditor, whose initiative was approved by 72% of voters. And so I'm wondering, what, if any, positive effects do you think the state auditor's actions might have on the processes we're concerned with?
Yeah, so one thing on the basic level that isn't the full impact of an actual audit, but I think is a clear result of that, is that earlier this year, both Senate President Karen Spilka and Speaker Ron Mariano noted that they wanted to take up some type of transparency or legislative process reforms in the upcoming rules. And although they would not admit it, it felt 100% a result of the high performance of that ballot question and how it won in every single district or one in every district and one in every city or town across the state, as well as the often negative coverage that they were getting in the media for how much they pushed to the end of the session or how many things that they didn't finish. And I think that that's a good opportunity to take advantage of. I do have one of my final slides is something where people can take action in bothering their legislators on that, of writing to them about that upcoming process, that I can drop in the chat, and we will send an action alert out shortly, and have been in touch with a number of other organizations about how we can put pressure on the legislature for that. And I think with the fight between Senate Auditor Gizaglio and the legislature, making sure that your legislators know that you care about them actually complying is also an important thing, because based on past history, the legislature will probably try to get out of having to do anything, and making sure that they know that their constituents are watching and their constituents expect a higher degree of transparency from them is very important. That was a great question. So let me go through, I can go through a few questions in the chat, and then I'll go through a few questions in the chat, and then I will share, I had an action that people could take connected to that. In terms of Diane's question about people who are particularly progressive, I'd say check out our scorecard. You can see who ranks higher on our scorecard at scorecard.progressivemass.com. It's my nice putting a plug on that. Let's see. I see the question from, let's say, Dago about cases where a legislator co-sponsors a bill to get constituents off their back and then in fact like actually doesn't support the bill. That's why it is particularly important that if you're to make sure that co-sponsoring a bill is just ask number one. I've seen legislators co-sponsor something and then vote against it on the floor. I've seen legislators vote against their own legislation on the floor. So the only way to only guarantee that legislators are actually doing something is them actually doing something and you seeing evidence of it. I can take any other questions that people have. I'll drop the and if there are no formal questions, Dan or Melanie, any other questions from the chat that I should attend to before I can share my slide to encourage people to take an action of contacting their legislators?
Don, I have a new verbal question.
Yes, go ahead.
But it looks like Ginger just put their hand up, so perhaps they should go first because I already spoke.
Yeah. Who went, Ginger? Ginger, you're muted.
You said get a receipt if you ask a legislator for something, and you gave one example, which is a signature on a bill. What are the other kinds of receipts?
So some of the other examples on that would be if they say that they're co-sponsoring a bill, make sure that they do in fact do that. And you can find that on the legislature's website. Votes are other receipts. So if they say that they're going to vote for something, make sure in fact that they do it. If they say that they're sending a letter with their priorities for the budget or for a bill that includes something you're asking them about, ask to see the letter to make sure that that letter happens as well. Because if they're saying that they're doing different things throughout the process, it's good to make sure that you follow up with them and ask them to in fact show you that they've done it as a guarantee, even if it's out of no ill will on their part for not doing things. Being reminded and asking for follow through is important. I think many legislators expect that their constituents aren't going to follow up with them on things, and so following up with them about things. If you ask for something, if you ask about a bill, following up and asking them about the status of something is always really important, so that they know that people are continuing to watch.
And your group, either you personally or the people that are at the top of Progressive Mass, are you in the legislature? Of course, you can't be in both chambers, but how much of the legislature do you and your compatriots actually observe it?
Yeah, so I'll often watch when they're actually taking a vote on a major bill. I will sometimes watch that, particularly to see the arguments being made. And this may not have been a great life decision back in 2020 when the legislature was voting on their police reform bill. So like in the Senate, I did stay up until like 4:40 a.m. to watch the entirety of the Senate's debate, to follow all and publicize all of the votes they were taking and seeing what people were saying. So we'll do some of that. I regularly kind of check the votes that are being taken at the legislature so that we can publicize them, that if they're good votes, if they're bad votes, we want people to be aware of them so that people can respond to their legislators accordingly.
Although so few of them are actually recorded.
Yes, exactly. Although not nearly as many of them as should be.
Okay, thank you.
No, it was a great question.
So John, my question is about transparency with these committee votes.
Mm-hmm.
Going back through the years, I know that some years ago on Twitter, you would link to a debate, and it was between Rebecca Rausch, and I do not remember the representative's name, but she was calling for total transparency. And this representative was saying, well, then people would yell at us if they knew how we voted, and how can you publicly say this? But it seems like the legislature is anti-transparency. They play this game where the Senate is like the good cop and the House is the bad cop. I mean, I remember I talked to Jamie Eldridge at the 2016 Democratic State Convention. That was our Massachusetts was coming down number 49 or 50th as worst as far as transparency. And so they made like this revision, and Jamie's like, yeah, I would have liked to have done more, but. And there's always this but. If you remember, like a few years ago, Progressive Mass and Act on Mass were calling for us to lobby our representatives for a rule change about the transparency published of the votes on committees. Now, I was talking to my representative, and he was only advocating so that who votes no is public. But we were like, no, we need to know who didn't show up and who voted yes. And there was this notion that the Senate makes all that transparent, but the House decided, where is that? I have never seen that at all. All I see is rejected or approved coming out of committee. I don't see how to figure out the members' individual votes.
So the way that it exists currently is so that the Senate, for Senate's own committees, will show things on a bill's page. But for most votes that happen in the legislature are in those joint committees of the House and Senate together. And the joint committee rules are where that fight really exists for making committee votes public. And the House and Senate have not agreed on a new set of joint rules for a number of years now because of that being one of the points of contention. So it still does show something where they will announce who votes no, but they won't tell you anything beyond that. In part because announcing who votes no doesn't spot people for not voting at all. As I was told by one legislator,
they don't have to show up. They can say they're too busy. Yeah, they can just not show up. And then how do you hold them accountable if you don't even know if they didn't even show up?
Exactly. So that's why
I just want to point out like how crazy it is that they haven't had joint rules.
Yeah, that they're still operating on old ones.
Like their relationship is so toxic and dysfunctional that they go entire sessions with no joint rules.
Yeah.
But that is actually I think that was one of the things Senate President Spilka mentioned recently about transparency stuff. They're gonna maybe they're thinking about trying is having the Senate's votes on the joint committees be published.
Yeah.
So it kind of gets around needing an agreement with the House. It's like, well, we're gonna publish ours. If you don't want to publish yours, you're gonna look bad. So if she follows through on that, that'll be pretty nice.
Exactly. So I'm going to take Mark's question. I'll take Rebecca's question. I will screen share a slide for anybody who's still on here who wants to email or call their legislators, and then formally close us out for the evening. Mark's question in the chat, which is an excellent question of do committees take minutes? And if so, are they available by FOIA request? They do not. They're black holes after hearings. The hearings themselves that they hold are publicly available. They're recorded on video and on the website. But the committees do not have public meetings beyond that where you would have documentation resulting from that. That is something that should change, that your legislator should know that you would like to see change. But it is something that draws a contrast, especially to how committees would have to operate on a local level, and even how Congress often does committee markups publicly. But I see Rebecca's hand up.
Yeah, I sort of combined two questions I had in the chat, which is the outsized power and money that the leadership has. Seems like it's stating the obvious, hamstrings everything. And so I was sort of wondering about the sort of behind the scene politics of how anything gets done. And having taught history for years, I have some idea of that. But, I guess the short thing is it seems like the reps and the senators need a union to stop the power of the leadership. And historically, has anything ever happened? Because I don't see why they would volunteer to give up that extreme unequal level of power they have, which then dominates how everything happens. It's not really a democratic system.
Yeah, and it's a system that's gotten worse in recent years when they voted to make the system more hierarchical, as well as I remember, I believe it was former Representative Denise Provo, could have been another former rep, who noted that once the total number of committee chairmanships and vice chairmanships totaled more than 80, so that you would have a majority of members in the House, by that there was it kind of destroyed a lot of independence, as you had a number of people holding positions with extra pay by virtue of the good graces of those in charge. I know that I feel like any large scale change to the way that that internal operation would have to happen by ballot. I know that the folks in the Committee to Reform Our Legislature are planning to file legislation to reform the stipend system to make it so that you have to act, your committee has to actually prove that it's doing things. So like a productivity standard, as well as to have the legislative pay be higher and flatter so that the base pay is higher, but then anything beyond that is much less so that that leverage is not as great. As a, kind of a contrast to the state level in Congress, committee chairs don't come with added pay like in the US House of Representatives. So it's not like it's a universal or kind of thing in the way that Massachusetts operates, and it stands out and has negative impact because of that. The one thing I want to do for those, to shout out to the 97 of you still on. One of the slides that I had for people, if you wanted to take an action tonight, if you're here, it's a great opportunity to contact your state legislators. That there are two things that you can contact your state legislators about now, if you have a moment, and we will send this out to you in follow up afterwards. And you can do this by phone, you can do this by email, and I will also drop this link into the chat. One, if you think that the legislative process should work better, you should tell your legislators that you think it should work better. That if both the Speaker and the Senate President say that they will take up different transparency-related changes, tell them what you want to see. Things like publishing committee votes, say publishing testimony submitted to committees, having more notice for hearings, having more of the committee work be done in public. Those are all things that if you want them to happen, your legislators need to hear from you, because so often legislators say that nobody in their district actually cares about those issues. But we know that many people do. And I think that the results of question 1 also show that many people want to see greater transparency. I would also put in a plug for contacting your state legislators in opposition to Governor Healey's recently proposed restrictions on the shelter law, where Governor Healey, in a move that felt frankly Trumpian, wants to have rules that ban undocumented residents from access to emergency shelter, and putting any additional restrictions that will put mothers with infants out on the streets. That is something that we in Massachusetts should be better than that. So if folks have a few moments before we formally break for the evening and I send you various follow-ups, you can look up your legislators' names. If you want to use progressivemass.com/findmylegislator, that links you to a page to do so. That send them an email, make a call, so that they do hear from you, because the number one reason why people don't do the things that you ask them to is that you didn't. The number one reason why people don't do the things you want them to is that you didn't ask them to. So many other reasons beyond that. That is one fully in your control. So I will leave this on my screen for a few.
But you'll send that to us too, right?
Jonathan, you're muted.